My grandmother did not go out for getting the vegetables today. Might be she's not well, she's ill. Now, how do we define a healthy lifestyle? And that's all we would be understanding in this chapter. So, this chapter would be focusing on the types of infections, the disease, difference between a disease-free and a healthy lifestyle, what is immunization and vaccination. So, that would be the kind of things that would be covered in this lecture. Now, once we are done with this chapter, you would be able to understand what kind of diseases are there, which are born by viruses, which are born by bacteria, and so on and so forth. The next important thing that we understand is the health. As I said, my grandmother did not go out to get the vegetables today. Might be she is not well. Now, how do I define a person with a disease and a kind of healthy lifestyle? So, there is a little difference between the two. When I say a healthy lifestyle, it means a person is physically, emotionally, and socially fit. When I apply this word health, I don't apply it to one single person. It's a kind of group or a community or the societies where we work around. However, when I talk about disease-free, that means I am personalizing something. So it's much more individualized, much more a kind of smaller perspective that we are trying to understand. So disease-free versus a healthy lifestyle. A major difference between the two is when I am saying disease-free, it is individualized. When I am saying health, it is more of a social, a community concept that we are trying to understand, where we are talking about a good quality of life for all, a kind of healthy lifestyle that is seen among the people of the community. Now, when I say disease, as I said, it is individualized. So what could be a kind of small explanation to it? I'm having my food, I didn't wash my hands. So the food that was there was not covered. Flies were sitting on it. The vegetables and the fruits were not washed. So those are some of the examples where we can say there are higher probabilities for you to get a disease. Now, if let's say you have a lot of internal organs that we have studied through our junior classes, if the kidney is not able to filter the urine, what would happen? You would have the accumulation of the poisonous substance that would take place in the body. And all these interconnected activities that we see are part of the understanding of the concept of disease. So whenever we are talking about individual, I repeat again, it's disease free. When we are talking about a larger group of society or a community, it is health. Now, coming back to an individual, you have individual being comprised of trillions of cells. Now these cells, when they are specialized into certain tasks, they form tissues. These tissues form the organ system and finally a organism that's there. Now, whenever a disease affects, it affects certain organ. Let's say you have Japanese encephalitis. So it affects the brain. Now, when you have an organ that is affected, whatever medication that you would take would be targeted to that organ, and the idea would be to get rid of that disease. Now we have to understand what form the disease could be there. It could be a viral infection, it could be a bacterial infection. If it's a bacterial infection, you would have antibacterial things that you would use, or the antibacterial medicines, which could be said as antibiotics. Now, these antibiotics, they work with the systems and try to rule out the disease that is present in the body. So, this disease, which I could literally in a very simple fashion explain as a discomfort or a kind of uncomfortable state of a person, could be resolved. A good healthy lifestyle would be determined by a disease-free individual. When we talked about the independence period, be it any country across the globe, there was very high mortality rate that was seen and the life expectancy was very low. over the years, what we have achieved is a higher life expectancy. And this higher life expectancy indicates that we are moving towards a disease-free society. We are trying to rule out at least the common infectious diseases that were creating a higher mortality during the period of independence that could be seen. So first of all, once a person is diagnosed of a disease, what we look for is signs or symptoms. These signs or symptoms are indications of the disease, and these indications explain the poor functioning of the body that's there. And the whole objective is to translate that poor functioning mechanism in the body to a well functioning mechanism in the body. Now let's say I'm suffering from a severe headache. Now this could be because a lot of students are shouting in the class. It could be because I am suffering from cold. It could be because there is sinusitis. It could be because there is migraine. Now there are so many reasons that could lead to a diagnosis of a headache, but based on the symptoms, based on the signs, based on the indications, we understand what disease a person is actually suffering from. So we classify this disease under two categories: the acute diseases and the chronic diseases. Acute diseases are those which last for a shorter duration of time. Chronic diseases are those which are for you for a prolonged period. So let's say I am suffering from a viral infection, a seasonal cold, and that is an acute disease because it is short-lived and it would be resolved in a period of, let's say, 7 days or a maximum of 10 days. But on the other hand, if I say the person is suffering from asthma, what would happen? This is a kind of prolonged poor health condition that is seen, and if it remains for a longer duration, it would drastically affect the health of the individual, ultimately leading to the effect on the productivity. So chronic diseases which last for a longer duration of the time, as we said, for example, asthma, would have an implication on the health, because that might lead to a child having vacations for a prolonged period, might be difficult to follow the regular curriculum into the school, and it could in long run affect the learning ability. So there is a difference between the acute diseases and the chronic diseases. Headache was one example that I helped you explain, which could be a sign in a chronic disease or it could be a sign in a acute disease as well. Similarly, you have lung infection, cough. So those are some of the common examples that we talk about. But when we talk about disease, I can further classify these diseases as an infectious disease vis-a-vis a non-infectious disease. An infectious disease is one which is caused by microbes or microorganisms. So whenever a microbe enters into a body, it could lead to a disease, and this could be prevented at a community level. So let's say you have, on the other hand, a non-infectious disease which could be a high BP. So high BP is a kind of disease which is non-infectious. It would not be transmitted from person A to person B. But let's say a severe cold could be transmitted to another person, depending on whether it's based on an infectious cold or not. So we classify the disease either as infectious diseases or non-infectious diseases. Now, so far, it was a very popular belief that peptic ulcers that are caused are due to acidity in the body, and they could lead to pain, discomfort, stomach upset, and all these are because of the lifestyle. However, later it was Robin Warren who discovered that it's not actually a lifestyle related disease, but he in his research found out that this is due to the bacteria that are present in certain people in the lower stomach region. Now, the lower part of the stomach, when it's affected by the bacteria, which is Helicobacter pylori, these bacteria affect the stomach and they lead to peptic ulcer. So this discovery drastically changed the previous thoughts that peptic ulcers are due to the lifestyle reasons, and which were not believed to be cured by antibiotics later on. Since it's a bacterial infection now, it can be cured by antibiotics. And Marshall, along with Warren, won the Nobel Prize for this research in 2005. So, we understand that with medical advances, with medical research, we have come across definite implications where we can say the categorizations of infectious disease vis-a-vis a non-infectious disease. Now, when I talk about infectious disease, let's take SARS, the severe acute respiratory syndrome that we talked about in the brain teaser, is a viral infection. Similarly, when we talk about malaria, it is caused by Plasmodium. When we talk about Trypanosomonas, it's caused by a protozoa. So you have different disease being caused by a different organism, and they are responsible for some illness or a kind of medically unfit condition, or what we call as an uncomfortable state. Also, when we study these, as we saw, it could be a virus, it could be a bacteria, it could be a protozoa that is affecting the human body. So, let's talk about typhoid fever, cholera, jaundice. So, all these are affecting the individual. Now, if we talk about dengue, AIDS, these are caused by viruses. If I talk about TB, anthrax, these are caused by bacteria. Similarly, common skin infections are fungal in nature. You have diseases like malaria, Kala Azar, which is caused by protozoa. So, different diseases have different carriers. Now, these carriers, once we understand, we try to understand how they multiply into our body. So, when we see virus, bacteria and fungi, these have a capability of quick replication, and they have a capability to multiply at a much faster pace as compared to worms. So worms multiply at a slower pace as compared to the viruses, bacteria and fungi. Again, very, very important. And most of the viruses are taxonomically close to one another, and this is something that we would understand as we talk more about vaccination. Now, as we said, for viruses you have antivirals, not highly successful as antibiotics for bacterial infection. Why? Because antibiotics block the biochemical pathway. Now, when you have many bacteria that are there, they try to create a kind of protective cell wall around themselves. So let's talk about one of the antibiotics. Let's say penicillin is one of the antibiotics. So what it does is it blocks the bacterial process that builds the cell wall around it, and as a result the growing bacteria becomes is unable to have more of cell walls, and ultimately they die. So that is one way where you are trying to block the biochemical pathway of the bacterial growth, and this is one of the major functions that antibiotics do. So we have various antibiotics acting on various sites in order to just curb down the growth or the multiplication of the bacteria rather. So that's where we understand the functioning of antibiotics. The next is how these diseases spread. So these diseases can spread from one person to another person, and this is communication, and therefore we say it's a communicable disease. So easier way to remember for you. The next is a non-communicable disease. Now this communicable disease could be through air, it could be through water, it could be through blood to blood contact. So let's talk about airborne infections. So tuberculosis, pneumonia are some of the airborne infections. However, if we talk about cholera, it's one of the waterborne infections. Similarly, you have blood-to-blood contact where you have transmission of HIV from mother to baby, and that's a case of blood-to-blood contact. You have diseases like syphilis and AIDS through sexual contact. So these are some of the ways through which you have communicable disease that could spread. The next is who carries these diseases. So the one that carries the diseases is known as vector. These vectors are the animals that carry those infectious agents from a sick person to a healthy person, making another person a sick person. So there are intermediaries similar to the intermediaries that you have in the economic market, and these intermediaries are what are known as vectors. Common example of the vector could be mosquitoes spreading malaria, spreading dengue. Now, what are the signs and the symptoms? The signs and the symptoms depends on the targets. So different species of microbes that are affecting would be targeting different part of the body. So let's say malaria. Malaria targets the liver, the RBC. You have Japanese encephalitis as we discussed. It targets and infects the brain. So you have a seasonal flu. It targets the lungs. It causes cough and cold. So there are different target areas for different infections that are there. Now, if lungs are targeted, cold and breathlessness would be one of the signs. If liver is targeted, jaundice would be one of the signs. If brain is targeted, headache or fits or unconsciousness could be one of the signs. So, in all of these diseases that we talk about, what actually happens is it affects the immune system of the body. Now, once the immune system gets weakened, the next thing is to increase the count of the WBC in order to fight that infection. And when you are fighting that infection, you are actually building up your immune system, and in this process, you have the disease that slowly and gradually fades off or it reduces. If the microbes that are present are smaller in number, the disease might get unnoticed. But if the same microbes are higher in number, it could be affecting your immune system, and in some cases it could prove to be life-threatening. So that's where we understand how these diseases are spread. The next important thing is the principle of treatment and prevention. So as we said, an infectious disease comes from one person to another. The idea is to reduce the effect of the disease and to kill the cause. So there could be two approaches that could be seen. So the first one is where we are killing the cause. So let's say if it is a vector-borne infection, the idea is to kill out the vectors, kill out the mosquitoes that are there. The next is to reduce the disease that is there. So that would happen only once the person has acquired the disease. If we are looking about killing the vectors first, we are focusing on prevention. If we are looking on that person has already got this disease, now on to the treatment, we are talking about the treatment. So treatment and prevention, two aspects that we are trying to understand. So once a person acquires a disease, then he has to take the medicines, rest, and the third important thing is healing, and that is symptom directed. So based on the symptoms, we'll say how the healing progresses. Now, as I said, there is a very big difference between antibiotics and antivirals. One of the reasons that antivirals is very difficult to create is because viruses have very few biochemical pathways or mechanisms of their own. They rely on the host or the machinery of an individual on which they are affecting for the multiplication process. So it's very difficult to understand the biochemical pathway or the biochemical mechanism of the viral infection, and therefore we have very difficult circumstances where antivirals could be created in contrast to antibiotics, which are much more predictable, we could say. Okay, so very few virus specific targets are aimed in case of the viral infections. Now, when we talk about any antibiotic that is given when there is a bacterial infection, there are certain limitations associated to it. The first is it is given only when the person is already diseased, so it can reduce the disease and might not help to recover him or her completely. The next thing is it takes time. So during that time there is ample of rest that is required. The third important thing is when there is an infectious disease, there is very high probability that it spreads from one person to another. So usually what we say is prevention is better than cure, and therefore we say preventing the exposure to a disease is much far better technique rather than moving towards a progressive treatment. So let's say when you have an airborne infection, there could be provisions for using the mask, avoiding a kind of overcrowded place during the high seasonal flu regions, flu periods. Then you have waterborne infections. In that case, you can check the food that you are consuming. Flies are not sitting onto it, contaminated water is not being used, or unsafe water is not being used. There is no kind of microbial contamination that is seen in the water. Vector-borne is by controlling the growth of the vectors or controlling the growth of the mosquitoes in those regions. So there are specific ways where you can prevent based on the target that you are looking for. So whether it's a kind of airborne disease, waterborne disease, or a vector-borne disease. The next is immunization. Now immunization is a very interesting thing. Once you have a disease that is affecting your immune system or whatever goes into your immune system, when the immune system sees something for the first time, okay, it responds against it and remembers it very specifically. So next time when you have something very similar to it, it remembers that it's a close relative of it and there is a greater vigor in the body to get rid of it. So elimination of the infection occurs very quickly than the first round in the case of second round. Clear? Now, for this purpose, there was a very interesting experiment that was done. So traditionally, when there was smallpox that was very prevalent disease during the past years, in India and China, the traditional medicine systems used to say or inject the skin crust of a smallpox victim onto a healthy victim. And that was the way they used to create the immunity. Now, what Edward Jenner did was a very interesting idea. Cowpox is a mild form of smallpox that is seen in animals. So what he did was he took out some of the samples from the cowpox and he injected that into a healthy person. And when he injected that into a healthy person, he found out that since cowpox is very similar to smallpox, a person who has already suffered from smallpox will not suffer from cowpox. And in this process, he discovered the vaccination. And now we have vaccination for tetanus, diphtheria, whooping cough, you have measles, polio. So all these are being under the vaccination schedule. Now this vaccination schedule varies from country to country. So in some countries you have polio, which is part of the basic vaccination. Like in India, as of now, we have oral polio part of the vaccination schedule. But in other developed countries where polio has been eradicated, you have injectable polio as a part of the vaccination schedule. MMR, DPT, DTaP, what we say, is another part of the vaccination schedules that we usually see. So this whole word vaccination came from cowpox because cowpox, cow is called as vaxa in Latin and cowpox is known as vaccinia in Latin. And from this cowpox vaccinia, we derived the word which is known as vaccination. So this is about the idea of immunization and vaccination. So in this class we focused about diseases. We talked about the acute and the chronic diseases, infectious, non-infectious, communicable, non-communicable, the reasons for the spread of diseases, the process of treatment and prevention, and finally the vaccination and the immunization. So we'll be covering up many more interesting topics in science. Stay tuned. Have a great day ahead.